The prosecution presented their evidence, the defense attacked it, and now, in part 3, the prosecution gets to finish the case by defending against those attacks. This is the third part in the series. You should probably watch the other 2 parts first. Anyway, let's get right into it. We are going to jump right into the first wall. Here, the prosecution produced evidence that the information in the documents is factually false, and the defense says that the information is true. The defense claim that it is accurate that Cohen was paid for work he was doing as personal attorney to the president, and that they had at least an oral retainer agreement, making the payments illegal. We will deal with those one at a time, starting with the amount of work that Cohen did. Cohen readily admitted on cross-examination that in 2017, he did do some work for Trump. That work included finding other lawyers to represent Trump on specific matters, threatening to sue journalists for Trump, and helping the First Lady on a trademark issue and the licensing of her image for a wax statue. But at the end of the day, he still estimates that the total amount of time spent on all of that was less than 10 hours. One very consistent theme the prosecution often touched on throughout this case is Trump's frugality. Some examples of that were included previously, but suffice to say that it's not unimaginable that a juror would come away with the impression that Trump was a penny pincher. Knowing this, it's hard to imagine Trump paying Cohen $420,000 for 10 hours of work. He probably would have either refused to pay or at least negotiated the amount down. But he didn't. That's because Trump knew that Cohen wasn't getting paid for work, and the conclusive proof can be found in the final invoice. Cohen sent the invoice at 11 minutes past 9 on the 1st of December. There is no possible way that Cohen did $35,000 of work in 11 minutes. Trump would not have looked at the invoice dated December 1st and said, "Wow, Michael sure did enough work for me in these 11 minutes to pay him $35,000. The $420,000 was not compensation for actual labor that Cohen was doing for Trump. There is clearly something else going on here." Well, maybe Cohen had a retainer. Even if Cohen did no work for Trump, if they had a retainer agreement, Trump would have to pay him anyway. Well, there is no physical retainer agreement, so the defense say that maybe Trump and Cohen had an oral retainer agreement and a plan to officially write it up later. They point to an Alan Weisselberg email where he asks Cohen to send a retainer, and Cohen, when testifying at trial, actually agreed that in the meeting between himself, Trump, and Weisselberg, there was a plan to create a retainer agreement. The prosecution actually agree that this was the plan, but the retainer would have been just another step in reimbursing Cohen. The whole point of paying Cohen as personal attorney to the president was to hide that it was a reimbursement. As Joshua Steinglass said in his closing statements, maybe if they'd actually created a phony retainer agreement, that would have given more cover to their story, but it would just be another false business record, and you would be considering 35 counts instead of 34, because these payments had nothing to do with a retainer agreement and nothing to do with services rendered in 2017. The lack of importance of the retainer agreement is further proven in this case by the fact that after Cohen didn't send a retainer agreement, he was paid anyway. McConney didn't ask to see a retainer agreement when he got sent the first invoice. Weisselberg didn't ask to see a retainer when he approved that payment. And Trump didn't call the office from the White House when he signed the checks, which specified they were for a retainer. Why not? Because all three knew that Cohen isn't actually getting paid pursuant to a retainer. He is being reimbursed for the Daniels deal. The retainer is just a red herring put forward by the defense. But there is actually one more key fact which completely disproves the idea that Cohen was paid for work or a retainer. Cohen was the personal attorney to the president for 15 months, from the start of 2017 until April 2018. But he was only paid for the 12 months in 2017. If they had a retainer, he would have been paid for the 3 months in 2018 too. If he was being paid for the work he was doing, he definitely would have been paid in 2018. He was fighting to enforce the NDA against Stormy Daniels after she started going public. But he wasn't paid at all in 2018. So he was the personal attorney for 15 months, but he was only paid for 12. And it just so happens that he was paid the exact amount of $420,000 split evenly into 12 monthly checks. And when we look at exhibits 35 and 36, it says that Trump is reimbursing Cohen exactly $420,000 split into 12 monthly checks. That's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. But there's more. We also have testimony that it was a reimbursement. Cohen said it was, and Pecker and Davidson both testified that Cohen told them he expected to be reimbursed. Cohen told them that long before his falling out with Trump, by the way. And finally, we have the most damning third-party account. That's Jeffrey McConney. He worked for Trump for over 30 years and made it all the way to senior vice president controller. He likes Trump. He has no reason to lie. And he said that Alan Weisselberg, Trump's second in command, came to him and told him that they were reimbursing Cohen. Weisselberg broke down the components of the repayment and outlined why they were paying Cohen double. Why did Weisselberg give all these details? He didn't do that for the other accountants, like Deborah Tarasoff. He did it for McConney because he trusted McConney. And McConney, who had no reason to lie, said it was a reimbursement. There's a paper trail too. We have McConney's notes from the meeting, and also the same content in Weisselberg's handwriting. And McConney, who is very familiar with Weisselberg's handwriting, attested that it's his handwriting. And it's a good thing that we have these documents too. If it weren't for them, it would just be a he said, she said. On one side, we have Donald Trump through his lawyers in court saying it was a payment for work. And on the other side, we have also Donald Trump saying it was a reimbursement. And these last few facts completely kill any chance that these 34 documents are accurate. We have Trump's filings in a civil lawsuit with Daniels saying it was a reimbursement. We have Trump including in a government ethics form that it was a reimbursement. And Trump willingly tweeted out it was a reimbursement. He even says that Cohen was given a retainer as part of the repayment. Cohen was not paid for services rendered pursuant to a retainer. This wall is proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Previously, the defense tried to discredit Michael Cohen and convince us that we should disregard his testimony. In a vacuum, they did a relatively good job, but the prosecution have some additional context to add. The defense talked about how large the payment Cohen made to Daniels was, and also commented on his ability to afford it. They contrasted him saying that it was very substantial and that he would not have made it without the expectation of getting paid back, with an audio tape where he and Davidson are talking about how the payment isn't that big. There is some key missing context though. That call is in relation to the bank flagging the wire transfer and asking Davidson questions about it. Cohen and Davidson aren't saying, "Oh, who cares? It's just $130,000. Cohen was rich, but it's not like he's just going to let a massive payment like that go. He testified about the huge shitstorm he caused when his bonus was cut, and the amount that it was cut by is actually less than the Daniels payment. What they are wondering about on the call is why the bank is analysing the transaction, and they agree that it's not because of its size. That's true. A massive corporate bank doesn't call up all of their customers every time they have a transfer of $130,000. They must have done it for a different reason, and Cohen and Davidson are starting to suspect that some law enforcement agency was asking the bank questions, which, by the way, they were. Another apparent inconsistency is related to a call Cohen placed in October. On direct, Cohen said that he updated Trump on the Stormy Daniels deal. However, the defense found evidence that he was discussing prank calls with Trump's bodyguard. He spoke with Keith Schiller for 1.5 minutes about a teenager threatening him over the phone. However, that doesn't mean that he's lying. The defense stipulated that Schiller and Trump were together during the time of the call, and there's enough time to briefly discuss the prank calls and then have the phone pass to Trump and update him on the Daniels deal. And even if it didn't happen on that call, Cohen could just be misremembering which exact date he updated Trump on. Cohen consistently updated Trump about the deal, so maybe he just saw that call record and assumed that it was the call where he gave Trump a specific update. Cohen can be wrong without lying, and being wrong on one insignificant fact shouldn't cause the jury to disregard somebody's whole testimony. Let's move on to the position in the White House. The defense says that Cohen was mad at Trump for not getting a role in his administration. It is true that at one point Cohen said it would be nice to be chief of staff, but after he didn't get that job, he was immediately gunning for something akin to the personal attorney to the president. We can see that in the text to his daughter after Reince Priebus became the chief of staff. When talking about roles that were still available, Cohen brings up a hybrid role. This is important, but to understand its significance, we need to learn why Cohen wanted to be personal attorney to the president in the first place. Was it for the prestige of the title, or just a handy way to hide the reimbursement? Maybe in part, but the main goal was to get paid as a consultant by the private sector. When Trump became president, companies didn't know what his policies would be or what he would do. So Cohen was the inside source who would use his years of experience working with Trump to advise those companies. And the title of personal attorney to the president was a great way of showing his credibility. In 2017, he made approximately $4 million from consulting contracts with 6 clients. So maybe Cohen did want to be chief of staff, but that, frankly, was always a bit of a long shot. And Cohen was certainly satisfied with the $4 million payday he got as a consolation prize. He didn't flip against Trump after he missed out on becoming chief of staff, and he wasn't lying when he said he was satisfied with his hybrid position. Another reason that the defense says Cohen's testimony should be disregarded is due to a number of lies that he admits to telling previously. But Cohen is pretty upfront about that. He admits that he used to lie for Trump, scheme for Trump, and threaten legal action for Trump. And the defense say that this kind of person shouldn't be trusted on the witness stand. To a certain extent, that's true. Somebody with Cohen's history is not the kind of person that the prosecution would want as a vital witness in their case. But the prosecution didn't just decide to choose him to be their star witness. Donald Trump chose him, and the exact same qualities that the defense are saying are bad and count as a reason Cohen should be disbelieved are the exact same qualities that are the reason that Trump hired him in the first place. Trump didn't want another by-the-books lawyer. He had plenty of those. He wanted a fixer who would threaten to sue anyone who spoke badly about him, who would help Trump underpay his contractors, and who would lie for him. When Cohen lied to his wife and his bankers about the Daniels payment, it was to help Trump. When Cohen lied to reporters, it was to protect Trump. When Cohen lied to prosecutors and the FEC, it was at least in part to protect Trump. And when Cohen lied to Congress and the Senate about Trump Organization business connections to Russia, he did it to protect Trump. If Trump gets to benefit from Cohen's lies for years, he should also be hindered by Cohen telling the truth on the witness stand. Also, if Cohen was going to lie, he would have told more extravagant lies. He could have said that he, as a legal professional, explicitly advised Trump that the catch and kill conspiracy with Pecker was a violation of campaign law. He could have said that he went through every detail of the catch and kill contracts with Trump, and he could have said that Trump personally planned every aspect of the repayment scheme. But he didn't, because that wasn't true, and Cohen told the truth to the best of his recollection. And his recollection largely matches the testimony of other witnesses and the physical evidence. The defense would say, well, of course his testimony matches the others. He admitted to following the trial before testifying. Well, sort of. We heard his exact testimony previously, but this line of thought is missing a key fact. It is true that Cohen was one of the last to testify at the trial, but Cohen didn't tell his story for the first time in May 2024. He pled guilty to charges related to this case in August 2018, and he gave the prosecutors his story then. So, unless Cohen has a time machine, there is no way that his account was influenced by 2024 trial testimony. And this brings us to our final point for Cohen. Cohen did plead guilty to falsifying business documents and illegal campaign contributions. And while he did serve his time and has gotten no decrease in his sentence for his testimony in this case, he is still a co-conspirator, which means his word alone cannot be used to find Trump guilty. But his testimony can be taken into account if there is other evidence that connects Trump to the crime or there's evidence that harmonizes with Cohen's account. And my God, there's a lot of that kind of evidence. So far, we have stuck to the trial testimony and the most important exhibits. And I'm sure that many of you have been wondering when all of the text and phone records were going to come up. Well, it's right now. So let's quickly go through the narrative again, and this time include the physical evidence. We are selecting the 12 months, which includes all of the key events that we have covered in this series. We will also be focusing mostly on the key days when important events happened. And just to be clear, a call log looks like this, with the first name being the person making the call and the receiver being the second name. The duration of the call is in the second last column, and we have two time columns. One is Eastern Standard Time, which is the time a call occurs for a participant on the east coast of the US. The second time column is UTC time, which is basically the time in London and is an international standard. The texts will also be denominated in UTC time, so the order of events will be matched based on that. A text log looks like this, with the actual content of the text being at the bottom of this column here. Then, we also have emails and other exhibits. The Signal app was also used, but there are no logs of any kind for the vast majority of that. So the meeting between Cohen, Trump, and Pecker, where the conspiracy started, was in August 2015, but we will be starting in November. AMI are approached by Dino Sejudin, and they pass the story on to Cohen, who runs it up to Trump. Trump asks Cohen to handle it and make sure that the story doesn't get out. The Sejudin deal was signed on the 15th. Howard, Cohen, and Pecker were actually pretty good about using only the Signal app during this time, so we don't actually have many phone or text logs, but we will see the conspirators get sloppy later. At some point between then and mid-December, Cohen requests changes to the deal, altering it to be in perpetuity and adding a damages clause. 2 days after that is executed, Howard emails Cohen to confirm the changes have been made, which pleases Trump greatly. In January of 2016, we just have one quick item. Cohen and Pecker said that Cohen would suggest stories and approve articles for AMI. Here, we have an email where AMI sends Cohen some positive articles about Trump, and he then suggests some changes. Those articles went on to be published in the National Enquirer. And our final stop, before we get to the McDougal deal, is in April. This is that time that Stormy Daniels' agent, Gina Rodriguez, tried to sell the story of the Daniels affair to AMI. But nobody cared, because this was long before the Access Hollywood tape was released. So they basically just ignored her. Now we get to June. So Davidson texts Howard about a blockbuster deal. This is the McDougal affair, by the way. And Howard tries to find out from Davidson if Trump is cheating on Melania. But Davidson won't disclose any details this early on. Howard again informs Cohen, and Trump again instructs to stop it from coming out. A couple of days later, Davidson emailed McDougal a retainer agreement. On the 16th of June, Howard and Davidson organize a meeting for the following Monday where they will discuss the details of the deal. Howard informs Cohen about this, who then calls Trump and lets him know. Cohen continues to pester Pecker and Howard for any updates for the next couple of days leading up to the meeting. On the day, Howard flies out to LA and has the meeting. The whole time, Cohen is constantly trying to call him and call Pecker to get any updates to pass on to Trump. After the meeting, a three-way signal call occurs between Cohen, Pecker, and Howard. They are unsure if they need to buy the McDougal story since there is no physical proof. We don't actually have the signal call since Signal does not store call logs, but we do have Howard organizing the call with his assistant. That evening, after some more calls, Howard tells Davidson that they are still immovable from his end. Davidson locates McDougal's old BlackBerry, hoping to find proof of the relationship on it. At some point shortly thereafter, Trump has a call with Pecker, where Pecker recommends that Trump buy the story. Later, Cohen calls Pecker back and tells him to go ahead with the purchase of the story. He says the boss will take care of it. Pecker then authorizes Howard to start negotiating the details of the agreement. Towards the end of June, Gina Rodriguez again approaches Howard about selling the Stormy Daniels story. Unlike how Davidson did for McDougal, she discloses a large amount of the story from the start. But once again, there is no particular urgency from Howard and the rest of the conspirators to cover up the Daniels affair. Anyway, Howard negotiates the McDougal deal with Davidson for about a month, and it's not going too well. By mid-July, McDougal is actually more likely to accept an ABC deal that would involve her telling her story in exchange for a spot on Dancing with the Stars. Davidson conveys this to Howard to spur an improvement in AMI's offer. They have a meeting on the 21st of July, but it isn't until the 23rd that they get around to negotiating a final price. A week later, McDougal finally rejects AMI's offer. Howard informs Cohen, and a plan is conceived for AMI to have another meeting with McDougal to convince her to take the deal. In that meeting, the sides agree to a price of $125,000. Shortly thereafter, Davidson notifies Howard that McDougal has reneged on that sum and now wants $150,000. Howard replies, "F it, not my money," and immediately calls Cohen. After a brief amount of time, Howard calls Davidson back to accept the new amount. 3 days later, the deal is meant to close, but the final agreement that AMI sends to McDougal is very different than what was agreed to at the meeting. They managed to sort it out, and AMI's lawyers encouraged Davidson to call Cohen as a courtesy. But Davidson is trying to avoid that because from prior experience, Cohen is really difficult to work with. In the end, they do have a call, and Davidson tells Cohen that this deal would not have happened without Dylan Howard's help. The next day, the deal is signed with payment to occur a couple of days later, thus concluding the McDougal deal. In September, Pecker has a lunch meeting with Cohen where he asks to get paid back for the McDougal transaction. This needed to happen before September 30th, as this was the end of the financial quarter and the purchase of the McDougal story would be identified as suspicious if the discrepancy was not fixed in AMI's books. They negotiate this reimbursement, but Pecker was under the impression that Cohen was either stringing him along, or perhaps Cohen wanted to pay, but Trump didn't. That would result in Pecker not being reimbursed, since Cohen couldn't even pay for his lunch without Trump's approval. So on the 10th, Cohen records a conversation with Trump where they discuss paying Pecker back, but he actually doesn't even end up sending it to Pecker. An AMI employee completes the contract in late September, and the day before the deal is finally going to be signed, Cohen calls Trump and updates him on everything regarding the transfer. The contract was signed on the 30th, and Cohen begins to set up the fake company Resolution Consultants to send the money to Pecker's shell company, Investor Advisory Services. In the end, Pecker decides not to go through with the deal and tells Cohen to just rip up the assignment agreement. Now we are getting into October, where the election is really starting to heat up. On the 7th, Trump's Director of Communications, Hope Hicks, receives an email from the Washington Post asking her for the campaign's comment on a recording that would come to be known as the Access Hollywood tape. Cohen is in London at this time, that's why his timestamps are a bit off. The next day, the story is released, and the fallout becomes apparent. Chris Cuomo is texting Cohen, basically saying that Trump's campaign will be dead soon. Gina Rodriguez takes the opportunity to once again pitch the Daniel story to AMI. This time, there is much more enthusiasm from AMI and Trump's end. The story jumps up and down the conspiracy chain for a bit before reaching Donald Trump, and they finally settle with Rodriguez on a price of $120,000. Howard tells Pecker, who promptly informs him that he is not going to pay. So they agree to go to Cohen, who acquiesces to distributing that amount. Rodriguez then approaches Keith Davidson to finish what she calls the easiest deal of his life. It was all already negotiated. All that he had to do was paper the deal and talk to Michael Cohen. With Davidson's cut, the deal went up to $130,000, since Davidson charged $10,000 for having to talk to Cohen and writing the agreement. So the deal is basically completely negotiated, and Davidson sends the contract to Cohen. But Cohen speaks to Trump, and Trump tells him not to pay it. The goal is to push it past the election, since he didn't care if the story came out then. So Cohen is basically stalling and making up excuses to delay. This included saying that the office is closed due to Yom Kippur, and also just ignoring Davidson's emails and calls. But Cohen knows that he probably will need to pay, so he sets up a bank account for his shell company Resolution Consultants. On the 17th, Davidson finally sets a hard deadline. Cohen fails to pay, and Howard needs to intervene to try and get the deal back on track. Cohen also realizes that the name of his shell company, Resolution Consultants, is actually identical to one of his friend's companies. So he decides to open a new company, Essential Consultants. By the way, Cohen ended up pleading guilty to felony charges for creating false business documents for both Essential and Resolution Consultants. So in other words, he committed a felony to change the name of a company that was literally just meant to be used for this one transaction and nobody was meant to find out about. Anyway, Cohen somehow manages to keep the deal in some kind of a limbo until the 25th. That day, Pecker, Howard, and Cohen have a three-way call where Howard criticizes Cohen for potentially ruining his relationship with two of his sources. Pecker also tells Cohen that he should do the deal given the risk to the campaign. At this point, Cohen has managed to get Trump's approval to pay the funds. Trump tells Cohen to go to Weisselberg and sort it out. Weisselberg and Cohen tried to find any way to pay the deal, but all their suggestions come back to Trump. Cohen then suggests that Weisselberg should pay it personally and that Trump would reimburse him. Weisselberg, who is making over $1 million a year from the Trump organization, responds that he needs to send his grandkids to summer camp, so he can't afford it. Thus, they reach the conclusion that Cohen will pay. The next day, Cohen calls Trump in the morning to get the final approval for the deal. He then walks across the street to his bank and funds the account from a home equity line of credit. He then sends Davidson a bank statement, and Davidson is finally convinced that Cohen will in fact pay. The next day, Cohen wires Davidson the money, and the deal is fully signed and complete on the 28th. The following month, Trump won the election, and in December, Cohen had his outburst about his bonus being cut, which led to the meetings with Weisselberg and Trump in January 2017, where the repayment scheme was conceived. Now, at the trial, Cohen, Pecker, and Davidson went through that account in much more detail. Suffice to say, there's a huge amount of physical evidence supporting Cohen's account. There's a huge amount of evidence supporting Pecker's account, and there is a huge amount of physical evidence supporting Davidson's account. Their three stories also match each other pretty closely. The idea that all three of them would fabricate their stories, and it just so happens that they match each other and all of the physical evidence, is preposterous. The only conclusion that one can draw is that the events described actually happened. With that, we are going to move to Wall 4. The defense put a lot of effort into undermining this wall. However, a deeper look into the facts will show that it was proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense claimed that Trump's relationship with AMI predated his campaign, so the help that Pecker provided him would have happened even if he wasn't running for president. To be fair, it is true that in exchange for access to participants on The Apprentice, AMI would give Trump a heads up on negative stories in the marketplace, and they also wrote positive stories about him. But this is in a completely different league than what they did as part of the conspiracy. AMI wrote negative stories about Trump's opponents based on information he provided. They basically gave Cohen editor's rights, letting him make alterations to articles before publishing them. They sought out stories and spent money specifically to stop them from being published. They didn't do that to leverage the stories against Trump like they did for Tiger Woods. They did it purely to help him. They were also willing to pay way more for the catch and kill stories because they were helping the campaign. Pecker never would have paid $30,000 for exclusivity rights to an untrue story if it was not his goal to help Trump's campaign. The defense also argued that what AMI did for Trump was normal and legal because they similarly helped Arnold Schwarzenegger for his campaign. That's illogical. What they did for Schwarzenegger was crazy, and also what they did for Trump was crazy. And just because the FEC in California decided that they couldn't prove AMI's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, doesn't mean that it was legal. And it certainly doesn't mean that what they did for Trump years later was legal. If nothing else, the fact that AMI were even investigated in California shows that what they were doing for campaigns was not normal. There were also some differences between what they did for Schwarzenegger and what they did for Trump.
And you testified on cross-examination that Arnold Schwarzenegger announced his candidacy for governor, and after he announced his candidacy for governor, 30 or 40 women came forward with allegations of sexual harassment. Is that right?
Yes.
And that you told Mr. Bove that you paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to kill those stories?
That's correct.
I don't want to make you do the math on the spot here, but what was the approximate average of those payments?
The largest one was $20,000. Then the other ones would be anywhere from $500 to $2,000.
Did you spend anything like the $150,000 to suppress any story in connection with the Arnold Schwarzenegger campaign?
No.
I believe you also testified that Arnold Schwarzenegger was the frontman for some of your fitness line magazines. Is that right?
That's correct.
Why did you spend money? And when I say you, I mean AMI. Why did AMI spend money to silence Mr. Schwarzenegger's accusers?
Mr. Schwarzenegger was critical to the bodybuilding industry, as well as the supplement industry, as well as the two leading publications, Us, Muscle Fitness and Flex, that we just acquired in the Wider acquisition.
So do I understand that to mean that you were, at least in part, motivated by your desire to protect your own brand value?
It was mutually beneficial.
Your arrangement with Mr. Schwarzenegger?
Yes.
When you say mutually beneficial, it also benefited Mr. Schwarzenegger?
Yes, it did.
To the extent it benefited Mr. Schwarzenegger's campaign, that sparked an investigation into potential campaign finance violations by AMI, is that correct?
Yes.
And as a result of that, I believe you testified when Mr. Bove asked you questions. You made some new rules to address these concerns, correct?
Yes.
Now, when you withdrawn, prior to your arrangements with Mr. Trump, and I am speaking of the arrangement that was formed in the August 2015 meeting at Trump Tower, prior to that, did you ever preview with a candidate positive stories about that candidate or negative stories about that candidate's opponents?
No.
Prior to that August of 2015 meeting, did you ever give a candidate the opportunity to accept, reject, or make changes to your stories before they ran?
No.
Prior to that arrangement with Mr. Trump from August of 2015, did you ever run attack ads against any candidate's adversaries that corresponded to those adversaries' polling numbers?
No.
The conspiracy with Trump was different in motivation and effect than their relationship with any other celebrity or campaign. It was also illegal. The defense repeatedly pointed out that NDAs are not illegal. This is true, but completely misses the point. NDAs are illegal when they are used for illegal purposes. For example, if they constitute a violation of election law. Using NDAs aren't illegal as an argument in this case is like saying contracts are not illegal to defend a contract somebody has with an assassin. So a lawyer could have looked at any of the three agreements on its own, and they would have concluded that it was all fine. But if the lawyer had taken into account the reason for the NDAs, they are clearly illegal. To be fair to AMI, the Sejuden deal was originally pretty standard. They paid way more than they usually would have, but the source agreement was pretty similar to previous legitimate AMI contracts. But this was before Cohen demanded and AMI granted some changes. The duration of the source agreement was changed from 3 months to be in perpetuity, and the breach penalty was changed from Sejuden not getting paid to owing AMI a frankly unenforceable $1 million. They also changed the payment from being upon publication to be immediate. This is especially notable since this change was made after Pecker found the story to be untrue. Thus, they would never publish it, and there was literally no benefit whatsoever for AMI to sign the agreement. But they did sign this deal, which had mutated into becoming very different from their normal contracts. Why did they sign it? Not because it benefited AMI, but because it benefited Trump. The defense also brought up Pecker saying that if the Sejudin story were true, he would have published it. But it was conveniently left out that he wouldn't have published it until after the election. And that's a key fact, because originally Pecker thought it might be the biggest story since the death of Elvis. However, he was willing to risk getting scooped by another news organization rather than publish it before the election. Once again, that doesn't help AMI. It only helps Trump. The McDougal deal is the same. Pecker said that it was National Enquirer gold, but he didn't publish it since it would have hurt Donald Trump. The defense brought up that it's not a catch and kill, since McDougal didn't want her story told publicly. That's again partly true. She didn't want to tell her story. That's what made the AMI deal so attractive. But McDougal was willing to do it. While the AMI deal was being negotiated, Davidson was simultaneously negotiating a deal with ABC. That deal would involve McDougal going public in exchange for a slot on Dancing with the Stars. Even after the AMI deal closed, Davidson texts Howard that he'll be informing ABC that McDougal has decided not to go forward with their deal, but he is careful to do that without revealing the AMI catch and kill. We also heard Cohen say that AMI made tons of money from McDougal's cover and articles, and that was the reason that Pecker didn't need to be reimbursed. Now, Cohen may believe this, but Pecker said that he decided not to transfer McDougal's rights after talking to a lawyer. What was actually said between Pecker and his lawyer is protected, but after the meeting, he decides to cancel the deal. Pecker also testified that the covers and articles were just window dressing to make the deal more attractive to McDougal, who wanted to restart her career. They were also useful to hide the true purpose of the deal, which was to catch and kill McDougal's story. There is no way that Pecker thought that 2 magazine covers and 25 ghostwritten articles by Karen McDougal were worth $150,000. In fact, when Pecker was getting paid back, he only asked for $125,000, since he put the value that AMI got from the window dressing at a maximum of $25,000. Now, we move on to the transfer, and specifically the tape. The defense really wanted to undermine this piece of evidence, and that's for good reason. It completely destroys any argument that Trump wasn't heavily involved in the conspiracy. It may be slightly unclear, but seriously listen to it and see if you can hear the words in the transcript.
I need to open up a company for the transfer of all of that info regarding our friend David, so that I'm going to do that right away. I've actually come up and I've spoken to Alan Weisselberg about how to set the whole thing up with
So what are we going to pay?
funding. Yes, and it's all the stuff. All the stuff, because you never know where that company, you never know what he's going to be.
Gets it by
Correct. So I'm all over that, and I spoke to Alan about it when it comes time for the financing, which will be.
Listen, what financing?
We'll have to pay you. So
Don't pay the cash.
no. I got no. Hey, Don, how are you?
That's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense can nitpick about the prosecution not asking Rona Graff any questions about it. But that's because, while Graff was on the tape earlier, she can be heard leaving the room before the relevant parts that I've played 3 times now. The defense can also fuss about the "Hey Don, how are ya?" But how is that at all relevant? So maybe Cohen thought he picked up a call and accidentally said "Hi Don" since he was just talking to Donald Trump. How does this in any way disprove what's on the tape? The voices sound like Cohen and Trump. Cohen says it's their voices, and the metadata shows it was recorded on the day Cohen says it was recorded. It's also worth noting that the tape was extracted from Cohen's phone, which was seized in an FBI raid from before Cohen was indicted for his charges. The recording was extracted from the phone before Cohen flipped on Trump. There is no way of getting around that recording. It definitively proves Trump's knowledge of and involvement in the conspiracy. Finally, we have the Daniels deal. And it is indeed true that Pecker refused to fund this deal. But that's actually pretty reasonable. Pecker was afraid that associating the National Enquirer with an adult performer would lead to them getting dropped by Walmart. Furthermore, look at how the previous deal went. Pecker paid a huge sum and after speaking to his lawyer decided not to get paid back. It really shouldn't be a surprise that Pecker didn't want to repeat this. The defense also brought up the story in the dirty.com, and while it is true that it was briefly available, Davidson and Cohen worked together to have it taken down shortly after it was published in 2011. This was actually the interaction that caused Davidson not to want to work with Cohen again in the future. The details of the dirty.com story obviously were not public knowledge, and there was a legitimate benefit to Trump's campaign to cover up Daniels' story. Now we get to the point of showing Trump's involvement. Previously, we saw other members of the conspiracy say that he was involved, but now we have the calls and the texts, and we can see that he is involved. On the 16th of June, after Howard gives Cohen the date of his meeting with McDougal, Cohen texts Schiller trying to locate Trump, and they then have a call. On October 8th, Trump calls Cohen about taking down the Radar Online story, which is about the Access Hollywood tape. When Davidson approaches Howard to sell the Daniels story later that day, Howard calls Pecker, then Pecker calls Cohen, and 3 minutes later, Cohen has a 7-minute call with Trump. On October 17th, the day of the first Daniels payment deadline, Davidson calls Cohen, and then Cohen calls Trump. And finally, on the 26th, in the morning, Cohen has 2 calls with Trump before strolling across the road from Trump Tower into First Republic Bank, and he then funds the account to pay Daniels. By the way, these are only the calls that occurred on the key days of the scheme, and also these are just the phone calls. We don't have any records from the signal communications. Then we also have the fact that Cohen needed Trump's approval when spending any money, like, for example, a $130,000 hush money payment. And finally, we have Cohen's recording. Trump was part of the conspiracy. It has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense also argued that the stories were bought to protect Trump's family and brand. That's not true. Trump killed those stories to help himself in the election. Let's just look at what the other conspirators articulated. Cohen said that Trump purchased the stories to help his campaign, and Pecker claimed that during the campaign time, Trump never expressed that he was concerned about what his family would think about the affairs that they were catching and killing. We also have these text messages from Davidson and Howard after Trump won the election. Davidson says, "What have we done?" That certainly seems to indicate that they thought Their contributions to the catch and kill scheme helped Trump's electoral prospects. We also have Hope Hicks. She's a Trump ally. Here is her testimony.
After it was published and on November 5th, did you discuss the article with Mr. Trump?
I did.
What, if anything, did you discuss?
He was concerned about the story. He was concerned how it would be viewed by his wife. And he wanted me to make sure that the newspapers weren't delivered to their residence that morning.
Did he also ask you whether you thought it was likely to affect the campaign?
Everything we talked about in the context of, this time period was about whether or not there was an impact on the campaign. So certainly I don't recall specifically him saying that. But everything was something that Mr. Trump said a lot is, how is it playing? He wanted to know how things were playing, whether they were playing well or playing poorly. And that could have been a speech, an article, a tweet. So I don't want to speculate, but I'm almost certain he would have asked me, how's it playing? And wanted to know how I felt the next few days were going to go, and if this was going to be a big piece of the next few days.
So even Hope Hicks admitted that Trump was at least in part concerned about the impact of the stories on the campaign. But we don't just need to rely on what Trump told other people. We can also analyze his actions. It shouldn't be a surprise that Trump had relations with Daniels in 2006, but he didn't pay her off until 2016. He didn't care if the affair came out until it would harm his campaign. We can look at Gina Rodriguez's 2 previous attempts to sell Daniels' story. It wouldn't have been a big deal for the campaign, so Rodriguez was just ignored. Then the Access Hollywood tape was released, and within 50 minutes, she was offered $100,000. It wasn't until Trump was afraid of losing female voters that he silenced Daniels. The Access Hollywood tape wasn't a massive deal for Melania. She literally came up with the idea of characterizing it as locker room talk, but the tape was a massive deal for the campaign. That's the reason they immediately bought Daniels' story. But there's more. How about the fact that Trump instructed Cohen to push the Stormy Daniels payoff out until after the election? Trump would then have not paid and not cared, since it was after the election. That is as definitive proof as we could possibly get that Trump's concern was the election. There is no way that one can say that Trump bought the Daniels story to protect his family or brand if he was willing to buy it before the election, but not willing to purchase it after the election. There is one difference between those 2 days, and it's whether the story would affect his campaign. Just stepping back and looking at the facts holistically, $310,000 was spent by AMI and Cohen to catch and kill stories. But the whole scheme is worth so much more. With the billions of dollars which are spent on presidential races, what would the going rate be for a magazine who is willing to conspire with a campaign? A magazine whose headlines are in the eyesight of every American in every checkout line. A magazine which works with the campaign on positive stories, they work with the campaign on negative stories, and they are the eyes and ears of the campaign, swiping up and silencing negative stories. They are willing to use their sources to negotiate deals for the campaign. It is obvious that it is a campaign contribution and a conspiracy. Illegal means were used to carry it out, and illegal means were used to cover it up. Trump was approving and directing it all, and he did so with the intent of influencing the election. Looking at all the vast amounts of evidence, Wall 4 is clearly and obviously proven beyond a reasonable doubt. This should also make Trump's involvement in the scheme to repay Cohen more probable. Now, by no means does it alone prove it. Just because Trump conspired to influence an election as part of his scheme, which involved creating false business documents, doesn't mean that he also conspired to repay one of those co-conspirators and hid the payments by creating false business records. But it does make it more likely. And we have lots of evidence of Trump's involvement in the repayment scheme, which will upgrade his involvement from likely to proven. To start, it was disputed if Trump ever saw the invoices. Well, he did. He may not have seen the email chains because he didn't use email. Trump knew too many people who had gone down due to prosecutors using their emails in court. But the invoices were stapled to the checks he signed. Tarasov may not have exactly said that she had a specific recollection of stapling every invoice to every check, but she articulated multiple times that for the specific checks in question, the invoices were stapled to them. But we don't actually have to take her word for it, because the invoices are in evidence. The quality is not great, but we can see the staple marks. That is proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Trump saw those invoices and still signed the checks, because he knew about and authorized Cohen being paid back. As for the vouchers, Trump may not have seen them, but the prosecution does not need to prove that. They just need to show that Trump approved the repayment scheme, a scheme which he knew would result in creating false business documents. We already explored Cohen saying that Trump was involved, but another key connection is Alan Weisselberg. He and Trump worked together very closely. Both Rebecca Minocchio and Deborah Tarasov testified that they worked closely together even in the December and January when the repayment scheme was created. Trump also wrote in his books that he works well with Weisselberg. Alan Weisselberg, my CFO, comes in for a meeting. He's been with me for 30 years and keeps a handle on everything, which is not an easy job. He runs things beautifully. His team is tight and fast, and so are our meetings. He also writes about how they worked together in the 90s during difficult financial times, and calls him a loyal employee. Nobody disputes that Weisselberg created the repayment scheme. We literally have his handwriting on the documents laying out the plan. Weisselberg got Trump's approval for this. He had to. He was the chief financial officer who could plan out payments, but he needed Trump's approval. Weisselberg could independently only approve payments up to $10,000. That's less than the $420,000 they paid Cohen, and also less than the $35,000 monthly checks. So Weisselberg created the repayment scheme with Cohen, and they went into Trump's office where Trump approved it and insisted it to be split into 12 monthly checks. Cohen even said that he felt like Weisselberg and Trump had discussed the plan before the meeting. Another key piece of evidence proving Trump's approval are the checks themselves. It is true that he didn't sign the first two checks, but he did discuss the repayment scheme with Cohen during a meeting in the White House around the time the first two checks were issued. We do have physical proof that that meeting happened, by the way. But the strongest checks are those that Trump signed himself. He was in the White House, he saw the invoices stapled to the checks, and he signed the checks. He didn't have to sign them. He refused to sign other checks. He could have called the Trump Organization if he had any questions. He did that for other checks. But for the 9 Cohen checks, he saw them and just signed them. Why? because he knew what they were for. He approved the scheme when it was created in January 2017, and he approved the scheme from April to December 2017 by signing a check each month. The defense brought up that maybe Trump wasn't paying attention when he signed the checks. He was a very busy man, but that doesn't pass the smell test. Are we meant to believe that Trump would be going through his monthly checks and he signs an $80 Verizon bill, a $50 water bill, and then comes to a $35,000 charge from his personal lawyer who is doing basically no work, and Trump doesn't notice that this payment is not like the others? And this has to happen 9 times, by the way. Trump needs a perfect 9-0 record of not noticing something is wrong with these checks. If Trump had called the Trump Organization about one of these checks, or if he had refused to sign a check, then maybe there would be an argument that Trump didn't know about the scheme. But that didn't happen. Trump knowingly signed these 9 checks because he knew about and approved the repayment scheme. Also, if Trump was too busy to sign the checks, he could have changed the procedure at the Trump Organization to have somebody else do it. But Trump didn't do that, because he was a micromanager and he's tight with money, so he wants to keep an overview of his finances even while being president. As Trump wrote in his book, "As I said before, I always sign my checks, so I know where my money is going. In the same spirit, I also always try to read my bills to make sure I'm not being overcharged." He also wrote about the importance of keeping on top of his finances in his other books too. Is this the kind of person who mindlessly signs 9 checks for $35,000 each? Trump approved the repayment scheme. He knew that hiding the payments would create false business records, and he approved it. From our timeline, we can also see that what the defense said about Stormy Daniels was untrue. The defense claimed that Daniels was attempting to extort Trump by making up a story and then approaching him and making him pay for an NDA with her. This is completely destroyed by the text logs. Daniels never approached Trump. Her agent, Gina Rodriguez, approached Dylan Howard at AMI. Rodriguez also did this long before she knew Howard was working with Trump. There was no extortion scheme. The defense also picked at small differences between Daniels' previous accounts of what happened in the hotel room and what she testified to on the stand. There were some small differences, but on the whole, it was a very detailed account, and it was almost identical to the story she told previously. But why does it matter if Daniels is telling the truth? Even if her story is true, it doesn't prove any of the aspects that are necessary to find Trump guilty. Well, if Daniels' story is true, then Trump knows it's true, and stopping that from coming out is a pretty strong motivator. We heard her account previously, and it's the kind of information a candidate wouldn't want coming out right before an election. It's the kind of narrative a candidate would be willing to pay and create false business documents to cover up. Which brings us to the intent wall, and once again, information from other walls can feed into this one, but it also includes additional proof of Trump's intent. The first part is the Access Hollywood tape. From analysing the timeline, we have now definitively seen that it was the Access Hollywood tape which motivated Trump's purchase of the Daniels story. This then led to the repayment of Cohen and the 34 false business documents. Now, Madeleine Westerhout did say that the Access Hollywood tape did not rattle Trump, but, well, there's this.
Now, you did not meet Mr. Trump for the first time until after the election, right?
That's right.
And was that in November of 2016?
Yes.
And you testified on cross-examination that you really had not spent any time with Mr. Trump until January of 2017, right?
Yes, not a significant amount of time.
And in the period of November 2016 through January 2017, in that transition period, you testified that you worked out of Trump Tower?
Yes.
Did you sit on a different floor from Mr. Trump?
Yes.
And did the RNC leadership in general sit on a different floor from Mr. Trump?
Yes.
On cross-examination, Ms. Necheles didn't ask you if you had spoken to her before, right?
She did not.
Have you spoken to Ms. Necheles before?
I have.
How many times?
Once.
And when did you last speak to her?
2 nights ago, Wednesday night.
On cross-examination, you told Ms. Necheles that Mr. Trump did not freak out about the Access Hollywood tapes, right?
Did I? I don't recall saying that.
The tape came out in October of 2016, right?
Yes.
And you did not meet Mr. Trump until after the election in November of 2016, right?
That's right.
And you didn't spend any real time with him until January 2017, right?
Not a significant amount of time, yes.
So you have no first-hand knowledge about his reaction to the Access Hollywood tape, right?
No first-hand knowledge, no.
Hope Hicks, on the other hand, was actually with Trump when the Access Hollywood tape was released.
Were you with Mr. Trump when that happened?
Yes.
Was Mr. Trump upset?
Yes, he was.
What was your first reaction when you heard the tape?
Just a little stunned. It's hard to describe. Yeah, it was definitely concerning, and I had, a good sense that this was going to be a massive story and sort of dominate the news cycle for the next several days at least.
Were you concerned about the effect it would have on the campaign?
Yes, it was a damaging development.
Why was it a damaging development?
It just didn't feel like the kind of story. It obviously wasn't helpful. But there were a lot of layers to it that complicated where we were trying to go with the campaign. This was kind of pulling us backwards in a way that was going to be hard to overcome.
In those initial conversations with Mr. Trump and other campaign staff, did anyone else the group express concern that the tape would be damaging?
Yes, I think there was consensus among us all that the tape was damaging and this was a crisis.
Were you concerned at the time about the effect that Access Hollywood tape would have on the female voters?
In that moment, no. Maybe a couple of hours later, something that crossed my mind, maybe the next day. But just trying to get your bearings in a moment like that, there is a lot going on. Not in that moment, but certainly eventually that was something that was raised.
You mentioned that you anticipated that there would be an immediate and significant media reaction, right?
Yes.
What was the immediate media response?
It was intense. It dominated coverage for, I would say the 36 hours leading up to the debate. At the time I got the email in the office at 1:30 in the afternoon on Friday, we were anticipating a Category 4 hurricane making landfall somewhere on the East Coast. And I don't think anybody remembers where or when that hurricane made landfall. It was all Trump all the time for the next 36 hours.
The Access Hollywood pushed the hurricane off the news?
Yes.
So, it pushed a Category 4 hurricane out of the news, and it was also the topic of the first question at the following presidential debate. We also know that Trump agreed to buy the Stormy Daniels story the day that the tape was released. He had previously rejected it twice. Trump knew the Access Hollywood tape was bad for him, particularly with female voters. His whole defense against the tape in 2016 was a distinction between words and actions. If a story like Stormy Daniels's came out shortly after the tape, it would have destroyed that defense. Trump needed to stop it from coming out, even if he had to pay huge sums to do it, and even if he had to create false business documents to do it. We also have the fact that Trump was willing to pay Cohen back double just to hide the payment. Given how frugal Trump is, that proves intent. We previously saw how multiple people close to Trump said he was frugal. He also wrote in his books that he is frugal. Actually, here's one more. My parents hammered frugality into me from an early age, and it's the most important money management skill a person can use. Call it penny pinching if you want to. I call it financial smarts. Yet, covering up the Daniels payoff was so important that he was willing to create false business records and pay back double. Trump also valued negotiating, never taking the first offer. You should always feel comfortable bargaining for goods and services. I do it all the time, and I'm one of the richest men on earth. Even in high-end shops, I bargain. After all, the more you're paying for something, the more the seller should be able to shave off the price. I hate paying retail, and it makes me cringe when other people do it. I've walked into stores and offered $2,000 for a $10,000 item. It can be embarrassing for me, especially since everybody knows I'm Trump and I'm wealthy, but you'd be amazed at the discounts you can get if you simply ask. You do have to be willing to walk away, but after you've walked away a few times, the price will come down. Yet, when Cohen and Weisselberg came to him with the repayment plan, he didn't say, $420,000 is a bit much. How about $350,000? He said, sure thing, Mr. Cohen. How about we pay you in monthly installments? Trump put a very high value on covering up the Daniels affair. It bypassed his frugality and it bypassed his honesty. He approved the plan, knowing that false business records would be created, but he was willing to do that to hide what he did. This brings us to our final piece of defense evidence, those being the government ethics form and Trump's tweet. These certainly undermine the idea that Trump was heavily motivated to hide the Daniels affair and payoff. He did tweet publicly about it to his millions of followers, and the ethics form is a public document. So clearly, Trump did not have the intent of creating false business documents to hide the payments if he was also publicly talking about the payments. Except, we have to look at the dates. Trump approved the reimbursement plan in January 2017. He signed the checks from April to December 2017. The tweet was from May 3rd, 2018, and the form was from May 15th, 2018. In January 2018, Daniels went public with the affair. By May, she had done multiple major interviews, and there was no longer any way to cover up her story. Also around May, there was speculation that Trump had used campaign funds to reimburse Cohen. So to counteract this claim, Trump tweets, Mr. Cohen, an attorney, received a monthly retainer, not from the campaign, having nothing to do with the campaign, from which he entered into, through reimbursement, a private contract between two parties, known as a non-disclosure agreement or NDA. These agreements are very common among celebrities and people of wealth. In this case, it is in full force and effect and will be used in arbitration for damages against Miss Clifford Daniels. The agreement was used to stop the false and extortionist accusations made by her about an affair, despite already having signed a detailed letter admitting that there was no affair. Prior to its violation by Miss Clifford and her attorney, this was a private agreement. Money from the campaign or campaign contributions played no role in this transaction. 12 days later, he signs the Office of Government Ethics form, which includes the payment in a tiny footnote. There's no point lying about it on a form if you've already admitted it on Twitter. And that is how, to deny misusing campaign funds, Trump admitted to a scheme that would result in 34 felonies. He was also nice enough to include language that would destroy his future lawyers' arguments that Cohen was paid for work he was doing or that it was a legitimate retainer. Trump lies and covers up the Daniels affair for as long as he can. He lies and hides until he can't anymore, and he has to come clean. Immediately regretting that, he goes back to lying and in this trial claims that it is a legitimate retainer, claims that he knew nothing about repaying Cohen, and claims that there was no conspiracy to catch and kill the Daniels story in the first place. But those lies mean nothing, because the prosecution have evidence and proved all of those beyond a reasonable doubt. Just like how they also proved this third wall beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution brought audio tapes, they brought documents, and they brought witnesses. And it is true that Michael Cohen and Stormy Daniels are witnesses that don't like Trump. However, the other 7 that we have featured do like him. Some of them are longtime friends of Trump, who see him as a mentor. Others have been working for him for over 30 years. Others broke down crying on the stand multiple times. And all of them presented evidence that helps prove Trump's guilt. They had no motive to lie, they swore to tell the truth, and they did tell the truth. There is just so much evidence that proves Trump's guilt, and it puts the defense in a difficult spot. If only Trump didn't have a recorded conversation about the catch and kill conspiracy, or if they hadn't written down the repayment plan, or perhaps if Trump didn't tweet about the reimbursement, then maybe the defense would have a chance. But there is just too much evidence, so the defense needs to pick at the edges of the evidence and misrepresent events, and just hope that the prosecution will mess up and fail to refute them. But that didn't happen. They had an answer for everything. So the jury needs to look at all 4 walls of this house, and the only conclusion they could possibly reach is that every wall has the strength to support a conviction, and Donald Trump is guilty of every single one of the 34 charges. That's the prosecution's last word, and that's the series. What do you think? Guilty or not guilty? This whole thing is obviously way shorter than the trial, so some stuff needed to be left out. Feel free to leave some of that down in the comments as well. Thanks for watching.